His first major job was for the Texas Centennial in 1936 and still exists in the Hall of State building in Fair Park in Dallas. He designed and painted the longest mural in the world, installed in a complete circle on the history of ranching. All of his projects were considered larger than life. This is the story of artist and architect James Buchanan Winn Jr. Some of his work has not survived. This is the story of the ones that have.
Buck was fortunate or unfortunate enough to be able to ride the crest of the times. That we hear a lot about the Depression times, and we sort of get the image that life just came to a halt during the Depression in the late 20s and early 30s. But there was still money being spent. There were still buildings being built. And there was still a demand for people who could design buildings and people who could decorate those buildings and people who could, back then they didn't have any given percentage of their budget that they were legislated to spend for art, but there was a feeling that your building was not important without some kind of art. And this took the form of murals on the inside, of decoration on the outside that is bas-relief or clay or stained glass or Blinko glass that Buck helped develop. And so as a result, in the 30s, murals were very popular, and people would put them, people being private investors would put them in their buildings, and the government, as a public corporate entity, would put them in post offices and other governmental buildings. And so Buck's role in this was one of being available for hire and of enough popularity that he made his living with his art. And he was able to get commissions and to paint the murals and even employ some of the unemployed artists who worked for the WPA during that time. So Buck was also a person who had good connections. He was a member of the Philosophical Society out of Houston, which was a society of community and state leaders who met to discuss issues. And Buck was a man of great principle and great dreams, and so he wanted his art to reflect that, and it did.
Buck Winn was born on a farm in Salina, Texas, 35 miles north of Dallas, on March 1, 1905, to James B. and Eva Winn. His father raised cotton and other crops, and Buck grew up in the hard farm life of rural Texas in the 1920s. He knew that he didn't want to be a farmer for the rest of his life. Buck expressed an interest in art, this early drawing showing an understanding in design and how things worked. After graduation from high school and the returns of a successful crop year on the farm, His parents sent him to Washington University in St. Louis to study art under Oscar Birmingham and Fred Carpenter. Not without protest. His father thought he should go to Texas A&M and learn how to be a good farmer, but Buck was determined to be a successful artist. He studied there for 2 years. He liked both art and architecture and decided to continue his studies at the Académie Julian in Paris. While in Europe, he traveled with friends to North Africa and sketched and painted. He noticed the strong desert colors of red, yellow, sand, and the scale of the early Egyptian and Moorish artwork. Buck returned to Dallas in 1929, and just as the stock market was crashing, decided it was time to open an art studio. Winn moved in with 5 bachelor friends, and the entourage of bohemians called themselves the Pearl Street Gang. 2 became famous architects, O'Neill Ford and David R. Williams. One was Oxford educated and a reputed English lord, Dennis Nettleton. Writer Horace McCoy, who wrote They Shoot Horses, Don't They? And cartoonist Ed Reed. The young men were invited to a dance one evening at the prestigious Hockaday School. There, Winn met Catherine Butler, and they married soon afterwards in September 1931. Thus, as Mrs. Winn often told friends, saving him from the den of iniquity in which he lived. The couple settled down, and Kitty started teaching school. Buck started looking for work. He became a part of the Dallas Nine and did a number of successful easel paintings.
I hope Buck Winn will be part of the mainstream conversation far more than he is now. And we're going to talk about the Dallas Nine thing, but he should be talked about on the same level that Tom Lee, also in the Hall of State, Nolan Travis, and some of those other guys. They should all be on the tip of our tongue at all times. But unfortunately, Buck Winn isn't, and I hope we can do something about that. Most of the passion and the interest in collecting what's called early Texas art now was generated during the sesquicentennial, particularly through a couple of exhibitions, but one in particular, and that was the Dallas Museum of Art's exhibition called Lone Star Regionalism, which subtitle for which was the Dallas Nine in Their Circle. Interestingly enough, although the Dallas Nine was supposed to play a huge role in that exhibition, 2 of the 9 were not even in the show. One of them was Buck Winn. And there were only 9. There weren't 11, there weren't 15, there were 9, and they were as follows: Jerry Bywaters, Otis Dozier, John Douglas, Lloyd Goff, William Lester, Charles McCann, Perry Nichols, Everett Spruce, and Buck Winn. So that's it. There were only 9 of them. And this received national attention because these artists were relatively young at that time. And this is really sort of the tipping point, the jumping off point for most collectors of early Texas art, what's come to be known as Texas regionalism or Lone Star regionalism. Regionalism with the capital R is, of course, a style, a school, how it looked. Lowercase r, it's a geographical designation. So you could be a regionalist artist but not be a regionalist artist, if you catch my drift, if your work didn't look regionalist in a certain way. However, because of the Miro program, the New Deal Miro program, artists were encouraged to paint a certain way, a certain look that develops, which we've called the regionalist style. Now, whether an artist received a New Deal commission or not, or was recognized as a regional artist, their style was very reflective and very consistent across the board. And I think that's where Buck Winn comes in, is that even if he did not receive any federal commissions, his work is very regionalist in style, consistently through the 30s and 40s and into the early 50s. And I think that's what's important.
Buck enjoyed working and designing, listening to classical music. His first Texas-sized commission was signed in 1933, and called for a series of very large murals to be installed on the 3 interior lobby walls from floor to ceiling of the new Highland Park Village Theater. The architects of the theater were Hugh Prather and James Cheek. The building was described at the time as one of the most lavish, ornate movie houses in the state. Buck had learned early that meeting with architects about their projects and collaborating with them on the public art inside and outside the building resulted in projects. The subject matter was early Texas history, LaSalle stepping ashore on the Texas coast in 1685. He designed 3 watercolor layouts showing how the murals would fit between the theater doorways, the stairs, and the upper balcony. The original designs and the murals themselves have survived. Installed in late 1935, the results were spectacular. Winn painted the murals on canvas and attached them to the walls of the theater's huge 2-story lobby. The Highland Park Village Theater did not survive, and the building was remodeled in the early 1980s. The historic mural was removed and given to the Dallas Historical Society. In 1999, Belo Corporation signed an agreement to restore the center section and display it in the lobby of their building in downtown Dallas. 2 conservators worked for more than 8 months to clean, restore, remount, and install the mural. The finished work, with the painted-on theater doors installed at the gaps on the bottom, is 22 feet high and 34 feet wide. The central figure in the painting shows French explorer LaSalle with his ships in Matagorda Bay along the lower Texas coast. In 1996, one of LaSalle's sunken ships was relocated and excavated from the sandy bottom of the bay by archaeologists with the Texas Historical Commission. The ship was called La Belle and is now preserved in Austin at the Bullock Museum.
And I saw it not again, or not at all, until I was in SMU in the 50s, and it was our theater. It was where we went to see movies. And I was in the lobby with a date, and I looked around, and of course I had seen it by then quite a few times. Like I said, it's where we went to see the movies. And I turned to my date and said, "My dad did these." And they were all over the walls. I mean, it's huge, and they go up the stairs and around the balcony. And he looked around and said, "Oh, yeah, right." And then went on and got the popcorn, and we went in to see the movie.
Winn clearly had an eye for history and creating the scale of large murals. His work was noticed by Eugene Savage of New York, then the premier mural artist in the country. Savage had a contract with the state of Texas and a short timeline. The Texas Centennial, celebrating 100 years since the founding of the Republic, was scheduled for Dallas in 1936. The Texas legislature had appropriated $1.25 million in Depression-era dollars to build a Texanic in proportion and centennial in character Hall of State building. Savage had been hired to produce historic murals for the Great Hall interior, and he had less than a year to get it done. He hired Buck Winn to be his chief assistant. A total of 10 artists, painters, and designers would become involved on this key project. The murals were painted oil on canvas in the Ossining, New York studios of Savage. Winn is standing in the upper right of this photo. Buck collaborated on the design and painting of the 2 very large murals with 5 sections of Texas history per side. In addition, Winn designed the 24-foot diameter gold-leaf Texas star surrounded by the 6 emblems of the nations whose flags had flown over Texas. This original design is still on the wall of his studio in Wimberley. Buck also was asked to design the main entrance to the Centennial Park, an 85-foot-tall obelisk with 4 bas-relief scenes of wagon train and cowboys riding to Texas. The opening of the Texas Centennial in 1936 was a grand affair. President Franklin D. Roosevelt welcomed the world to Texas.
My friends of Texas, I have come here today to bear the tribute of the nation to you on your 100th birthday, for you are 100 years young.
And what a birthday party! A huge $25 million exposition in Dallas with all Texas playing host. 200 acres of magnificent buildings, a new city, a great city, a city of 1,000 sights and 1,000 wonders. Small wonder then that the whole nation is talking about this big Texas exposition. The design of the buildings is distinctively Southwestern, a dramatic combination of modern architecture and the simple beauty of the old world. The motive is carried throughout, even to the final touch of stately statues, brilliant fountains, and striking mural decorations.
So there were 4 mural programs in the country, public art programs, let's call them, during Roosevelt's New Deal. The Public Works of Art Project, the Treasury Relief Art Project, the WPAFAP, the Works Progress Administration Federal Art Project, and then what was called the Section of Fine Arts. Generally, the WPAFAP pieces were for post offices, not always, but most of the time. Tended to be a little smaller. The big boys, the big money was in the section commissions. Most of the times those were multiple panels. The best example close by to us is the one at Amarillo, the Amarillo Post Office mural. A couple of other examples are the San Antonio Federal Courthouse and the El Paso Federal Courthouse. Now, I suspect that Buck Winn probably entered some of these, but as we know, he was a little bit uncomfortable with the whole federal money thing. And there were several artists who were very uncomfortable with that. Harold Bugbee, for example, up here. He was very close friends with J. Evetts Haley, and Haley, of course, is notorious for his anti-Roosevelt stance. And so they weren't alone in artists, having sort of mixed feelings, but at the same time, work was work, and they had to make a living, and it was, in fact, the Great Depression. So it was problematic for some artists to accept these commissions, and I would just about bet that Buck Winn entered one or more of these competitions.
Buck took his proceeds from his work and started looking for some Texas land to buy. He found almost 1,100 acres in Wimberley, a very small community in Hays County in central Texas. The land was rocky, hilly, had cedar trees, and totally unfit for any type of farming. Kitty had decided that the life and pace in Dallas was taking too much of a toll on Buck and encouraged him to move. By 1941, they were living in the shepherd's cabin on the ranch land a few miles outside the Wimberley Square. Wimberley had started in the 1840s as a small community with a mill. 100 years later, the mill was gone, and Wimberley had developed a few rock buildings, built not in a square, but along 2 strips that to this day is called the Square. Buck loved his ranch, and he loved Wimberley.
I can remember the laughter, the hospitality. I remember being so enamored of the lifestyle, the simplicity that Buck and Kitty knew. Now remember, Kitty, wore white gloves. Her background had been in Little Rock, Arkansas, well-known family, a lot of etiquette, a lot of training to be a lady. And so she found herself in Wimberley, Texas,
with this wild and woolly and wonderful creative Buck Winn.
Giving you a little history, my mother and dad bought this ranch in 1937, and my dad and mother were both 32 years old. So leaving Dallas and coming to this ranch that on the deed was described as 11 miles from San Marcos on the Rio Blanco. There was no mention that there was a town of Wimberley nearby, although it was only we're 2 miles from the square. It was very remote in those days. The road was just being paved from San Marcos. We moved here in the early 40s when I was 5.
He invited his father and mother to come see the Winn Ranch, and his father announced that the land was worthless and you wouldn't be able to grow any crops, which was exactly what Buck had been looking for. He told his dad, "Yep, you're right, but it sure is purty." Winn was contacted by the magazine Farm and Ranch in 1937 to produce a color painting for their cover. This work clearly shows the humor and twinkle in his eye that Buck always had ready for friends and projects that warranted it. Buck had been exposed to this part of Texas after landing a contract to do 2 murals for the Gonzales Memorial Museum, built by the state of Texas as part of the centennial celebration about the contribution of the folks from Gonzales and their small cannon who told the Mexicans they could come and take it if they wanted it back. Winn designed and painted 2 murals, one that is almost all text, telling the story of the citizens of Gonzales and their contributions to the forming of the Republic of Texas, and the second showing the cannon, Travis, and how Texas served as the doorway for westward expansion to California and the forming of the United States. The murals were delivered in 1938 and hang today in the 2 rooms of the original museum. Buck stayed active talking with architects and submitting designs and plans for the interior and exteriors of public buildings. He landed a large contract with the Commercial National Bank of Shreveport to do 5 murals on the history of Louisiana. The process he followed would be a meeting with the final decision makers, then do a drawing of how to represent their ideas. After approval, he would do a final watercolor design and start work on the scaled-up mural. Painters would be hired to assist, but Buck would give each a watercolor design to go by, and he would do the principal figures. The final work would be done in oil on canvas, rolled, and then delivered on site to the new building where it would be applied to the walls. These murals were removed in 1989 and restored for a year and a half in Houston, then replaced on the remodeled bank lobby walls. The colors are particularly brilliant, the water that is represented in many scenes having been done in palladium. Buck received a contract with the River Oaks Theater in Houston in late 1939 to produce and deliver 2 large interior wall sculptures. The bas-relief female figures were installed on either side of the theater screen. They are still there today. The Hillcrest Mausoleum in Dallas asked Buck to paint a series of ceiling scenes of wildlife along a decorated ceiling in 1940. All of that work is still there, as restful as the occupants of Hillcrest. In 1941, Buck was asked to create a bas-relief sculpture for the front of the Telenews Dallas Theater. This unique chain of theaters was active during World War II and ran continuous news clips and the March of Time series. This building and its sculpture was lost when the theater closed after the war and was torn down.
Buck was not shy about submitting bids on a number of different public installations, all the way from the Rio Grande Valley to the northern border of Texas. And he received many of them and put them up. But again, as Americans, we're not very good conservators of art of any different period. We think that art goes out of style. I personally don't happen to think so. And so in our American society and our inclination to bulldoze all of our old buildings, all of our old art, all of these things, and build anew, that means that many of the installations that Buck created went from this studio to the location, were finished on location, and survived for 2 or 3 decades, and then change gobbled them up.
I thought growing up here at the Winn Ranch was probably very normal childhood until I saw how other people lived with fathers that went off to work in the morning or went out in the fields as ranchers. And my dad was at home with us, and we ate 3 meals a day, and he had company all the time, and one project right after another going on in the studio. The walls in this room were full of murals and workmen and scaffolding, and we had the bedroom wing on one side of the house and the living room wing on the other side with the kitchen and the dining area. And we just tripped back and forth through the studio, and my dad was part of my life, sometimes on a scaffold looking down at me, sometimes sitting at his drawing board working.
Buck and Kitty had 2 children, Tinka and Jim. Mercantile National Bank in Dallas was completing a new 31-story building for downtown Dallas, and Buck was asked to come up with a different design for the lobby. His suggestion was an all-wood mosaic mural. The resulting mural was a first in using 12 different types of wood to create the contrast in the scene. The mural was installed in the main bank lobby above the teller's windows in 1944 and remained until the bank was remodeled in the 1970s. It was then taken down and destroyed. No color photograph of the work has been found. There was a contest from the U.S. Postal Service in 1945 to create a stamp to celebrate the 100-year anniversary of Texas joining the Union. Buck entered the contest, and his design was chosen. The 3-cent U.S. stamp featured the Texas flag and the U.S. flag flying together. But Buck was not content with just doing art. He was also an inventor. The ranch was surrounded by cedar trees, and often men were hired to remove the cedar trees and make fence posts.
Back in the 40s and 50s and 60s, we didn't have imported Christmas trees like we do today. Everybody here cut a cedar tree and decorated it for Christmas. And there were some people that moved in that didn't have access to cedar trees. So Buck put an ad in the paper saying, "Free Christmas trees, come to the Winn Ranch." And then he said a minimum of 100, meaning he wanted you to cut the dadgum cedar trees.
Buck thought there might be a better use. He experimented with a process to mix a cedar formula that resulted in something he called cedar rock. It was as hard as cement, yet could be cut, drilled, polished, and installed as flooring, tabletops, or wall decoration. A company was formed, and cedar rock was offered with this brochure. Buck's house and studio, which he often used as a laboratory, had cedar rock installed.
He rented an old skating rink on Hunter Road in San Marcos and set up a plant there. And I think if Buck had been an industrialist, he would have really made a business out of his cedar works. But what his idea was to start it, but he couldn't turn loose of it. So the company kind of died.
The Pearl Brewing Company in San Antonio had always preferred to use Texas artists to tell their story of Judge Roy Bean and his Jersey Lily Saloon. In 1950, the company decided to renovate the old brewery stables and turn them into an entertainment hall and hospitality room. The renovation was called the Pearl Corral, featuring a stage designed after Roy Bean's saloon. They commissioned Buck Winn to design and paint a continuous mural to go around the circumference of the oval-shaped room. This masterpiece was titled The History of Ranching, and it would be the longest mural in the world, 280 feet, almost the length of a football field, covering almost 2,000 square feet of canvas. The only problem, it was so large that unless you went to the Pearl Corral for a show, you never saw the mural. All was well for the next 20 years. Then Pearl sold, and the new owners decided to remodel and asked that the mural be tossed. It was removed, but not put in a dumpster.
And I began investigating further, called more old friends and more people who were Buck's contemporaries, and I said, do you have any idea where this mural is? I have a photograph of it with the ranching, history of ranching on in the background and some tables and chairs in front of it. And I just continued digging until I found out it had been installed at the Pearl Brewery in San Antonio in 1950. And I was simply intrigued that something like this could disappear and no one could know where it was, or in what condition it was, or whether it even still existed. And so I assigned myself the task of finding this mural. My first step was, of course, to call the Pearl Brewery and say, do you know anything about this? Well, the brewery was under new ownership, and they were people from out of state, and they couldn't care less about a mural that had been on their property 60 years prior. So Mr. Remling began to open up a little bit more and finally said, well, I was there when the mural was taken down, and it's painted on canvas. And I said, yes, I knew that. And he said, they cut it in sections when they took it down. And I said, oh no. But he said, and they had it rolled up and it was out by the dumpster. And I thought, that's a shame. We shouldn't let that mural just be put in the trash. It's a wonderful thing. Surely it has some sort of purpose or function. And if really they don't want it for historical purposes, I like a couple of those horses, and I could just cut them out and frame them and put them on my living room wall. And I said, okay, so what happened to the mural? And he said, well, I picked up the rolls and I took them to this storage shed and I put them up on top of some cabinets where they'd be out of the way. And he said, when I retired 4 or 5 years later, I just kind of forgot they were up there. And so I didn't take them with me or do anything like that. So he said, I don't know. That's the last time I saw the murals. But you could look. Maybe they're still there. And he called back in about 30 minutes and said, we've got your pictures. And I said, oh, wonderful. Thank God they still exist. And he said, well, what's our next step? And I said, well, the next step is that the Institute of Cultures, the Wimberley Institute of Cultures, would like to negotiate with you for the acquisition of this mural and to bring it back home to Wimberley and make it a part of our community's permanent art collection. And he said, okay, when do you want to get it? And I said, tomorrow. I called Wimberley, asked for some representatives from WIC to meet me at the Pearl Brewery in the morning in San Antonio, and I came up from the Rio Grande Valley, and they came down from Wimberley, and we met, pulled into the work area. He led us to a shed with an asphalt floor, and here was the pile of rolls of canvas like this. There were 11 of them. Thank goodness they hadn't cut it in small pieces, but they had cut it in rather large sections. And so I said, oh, there it is, thank goodness. And he said, well, don't you want to look at it and see if that's the right picture? And I said, well, yes. And so he pulled out about 10 feet from one of the rolls. And I said, no, stop. You don't have to, mess with it anymore, because I know that is the mural. Once the mural was legally in the hands of the Wimberley Institute of Cultures, the problem arose for restoring it, for actually having professional restoration and conservation applied to this.
The rolls had flattened out and there were creases through the paintings. And so when the Wimberley Institute of Cultures acquired them, we spread them out in Deanne Story's driveway and took pictures of the murals, and then lightly cleaned them and re-rolled them paint side out on what are called sonotubes. They're the same things that you pour cement columns in for bridges. They're about this big around. And then covered them with sheets and put them in the climate-controlled area of Texas State University. But over the period from 1992, when we restored the first mural, to 2009, we restored 4 sections.
Buck signed a contract with Amon Carter of Fort Worth to design and install the Magic of Flight bas-relief mural at Amon Carter Airport in 1952. The murals were to be placed in the main terminal building at the new airport and serve as the entrance to the airport dining room area. 3 bas-relief designs were approved, with the right and left sides having historical themes, and the center section showing Texas with the Magic of Flight female figure having an airplane suspended above her hand. Both sides were over 6 feet tall, and the center section was 15 feet square. All were covered in gold leaf and formed the largest murals of their kind in the world. It is estimated that over an acre of gold leaf was used.
We landed at Amon Carter Field, and I thought, well, here I am in Texas, I better get out and see what it's like. This was September, and I found out right away it's plenty hot. But we walked across the ramp into the Amon Carter terminal, and this was different than any terminal I'd ever been in. There were upholstered sofa chairs and gentle music playing. Announcements were very softly given. And then up across the wall was a beautiful gold frieze depicting travel in Texas. And little did I know that some years later, I've been involved with helping to restore the work of the artist who had done this frieze, and of course that was Buck Winn.
The installation was complete in 1953, and the mural stood proudly until Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport was built, and the Amon Carter Terminal was bulldozed in 1979. Victoria Bank and Trust wanted a lobby mural on the history of South Texas and contracted with Buck in 1954. The bank was building a new 6-story office and displayed the mural at the end of the main lobby. The 12-foot-tall and 38-foot-long mural was painted on linen and outlived the bank. It is still located on the main floor of the office tower. In addition, Buck designed and installed a 14-foot Six Flags Over Texas bas-relief on the opposite bank wall, using a variation of his design from the Hall of State. In 1954, Buck landed a contract with the First National Bank of Arizona in Phoenix. He designed 2 ceramic murals that used over 1,000 pieces of fired tile.
Met Buck Winn, and he asked me, his words were, can you hold a brush? He wanted an assistant to make these murals for the First National Bank in Phoenix, Arizona, these 2 big murals that he'd planned using tile, about 1 foot square and about 1.5 to 2 inches deep. And it required tamping our own tile to do the job, and then curing the clay, and then carving each tile to fit the whole big design. That both murals, I think one was something like 40 feet long by 25 feet tall, and the other was about 30 feet long and 20 feet tall, something like that. Anyway, they were quite big. And this old barn, just outside Austin towards Oak Hill, and anyway, they built the kiln to fire all this stuff. Buck was the most laid-back guy that you could possibly wish to meet, really. At least he was with me around. And we had a good time. I had the greatest respect for him because he was the quintessential Texan for me in those days. He somehow exemplified that laid-back, hard-working, tough kind of person with very few inhibitions. He wanted the effect to be a kind of a rough-hewn Indian look, since it was going to Phoenix, and southwestern look.
The building has survived, the bank is long gone, and one of the murals remains as it was installed. The mural that is futuristic in design was allowed to stay in place by the new building owners, Arizona State University. The larger mural that showed the history of Arizona was chipped away. Becoming intrigued and inspired by working in ceramics on the sides of buildings, Buck was asked by his friend, Dr. J.G. Flowers, president of Southwest Texas State in 1959, to produce a bas-relief for the side of the library at the San Marcos campus. The resulting carved concrete and Blinko glass is over 4 stories tall and covers 800 square feet. Winn was asked to capture the spirit of the college and said on its completion that, "This is an opportunity to say that Texas is big and we have big art in Texas." It looks as good today on the side of Flowers Hall as the day it was installed. 1959 saw Buck start teaching at the University of Texas School of Architecture. He was not a certified architect and chose as his textbook Architecture Without Architects by Bernard Rudofsky. He would teach there for the next 7 years, along with guest lectures at Texas A&M, Princeton, Berkeley, and Rice.
I was a freshman in architecture in the fall of 1959, and so we all had to take freehand drawing as one of our courses, and Buck was the instructor for it, and so. And I think I had him in the following semester in the spring, and the big memory is that sometime in the early spring, well, he invited everybody, all the students, to come out here to the ranch, and I've never even heard of Wimberley before, and so we all came out here and we saw the structures he had out here and the studio here, and everybody was wowed, and we spent a whole afternoon out here. Yeah. It's just stuck with me all my life that what it was like to be with him, and he was a real free thinker, and he wasn't committed to, or he didn't have a conventional architectural training, and he wasn't worried about the size of windows and doors and everything that we're all geared up to do when you do a lot of drafting and all that sort of thing. And he just felt like he had a million ideas about stuff, and he just sort of bubbled about things. Hard to forget.
There was growing interest in Buck's ideas on architecture and the use of something the folks at the University of Texas called Buck's gunk.
One experience in teaching near Buck was to actually beg him to use some of his magic material, which we referred to as Buck's gunk, a combination of cement and plastic and fiberglass reinforcing. Buck brought in some of it, and we mixed it up, and we applied it with putty knives and butter knives. Just laid it on like you would a frosting on a cake, and it really transformed the nature of the project. One of the things that looked very real, and as if it was made of a more permanent or more traditional material, was that it was light gray, the color of one of the main elements, the cement. So I actually did have some experience with this gunk in that little project. Now, I refer to this as his secret Coca-Cola formula, because he would not tell us what exactly was in that gunk. He would not tell us the amounts. So he was very protective of it, and he probably had a patent on it. I'm not sure about that.
Once Buck had discovered the wonders of his combination fiberglass and cement mixture, he invented a spray gun he called Archilithic and got a patent on the process. He turned now more into architecture, designing and experimenting with sprayed fiberglass and concrete shapes. He built his own airplane hangar. He signed a contract with H.B. Zachary Construction Company from San Antonio to explore new uses of sprayed fiberglass and cement. The Archiliptic continuous strand gun was used on a number of successful projects. Buck and Kitty had always been very involved in the Wimberley community, and one of his strongest interests was in a community church. Buck was involved in the design and construction of the Chapel of the Hills in 1960, working with architect Earl Dillard. He wanted the sanctuary to have lots of light and a view to the outside. He wanted the building to face east so that the morning light would give a strong glow to the Blinko glass simply designed cross that he installed. The results are apparent today. Aquarina Springs in San Marcos has been a favorite spot for thousands of years, first favored by the Native Americans and later by students and families in Central Texas. Buck was asked to construct a main entrance sign in 1962 and a cover for patrons awaiting the park's sky ride. He designed a unique and beautiful artistic solution using his new sprayed fiberglass and concrete, translucent morning glories. The water park has been taken over by Texas State University, and they are in the process of removing all signs of the former Aquarina Springs entertainment site. The morning glories had been painted over, and their translucent appearance was gone. Awaiting destruction, the university has transferred the ownership of the Winn morning glories to the Hays County Historical Commission, who is making plans to save the structures. One of the more unusual requests for a work of art came in 1967 from Howard Payne College in Brownwood, Texas. Someone there had hit upon the idea of building the Douglas MacArthur Academy of Freedom and constructing, inside the building, rooms various temples of freedom. Buck Winn was hired to do the Mediterranean Room and specifically designed 4 15-foot-tall Egyptian statues of the pharaoh Ramses, who was the pharaoh at the time of the flight of the Israelites. Buck built 4 pharaohs with a fiberglass mold, plus the Egyptian columns that surround the room and the hieroglyphics displayed between the pharaohs. The results are spectacular. He made a mixture of red sandstone in a fine texture and applied it as the final finish on the Egyptians. He wanted to replicate the carved stone he had seen in Egypt 38 years earlier. He aged the look and put time-worn streaks across each pharaoh at different points. Texas Christian University in Fort Worth had seen Buck's work at Aquarina Springs and wanted something similar installed on their campus. The result was Frog Fountain, installed in 1968, now a landmark that has been maintained and is happily flowing with water and keeping frogs happy. (1968) also saw the opening of Hemisphere in San Antonio. Because of Buck's close attachment to H.B. Zachary, who was building the Hilton Riverwalk Hotel, Buck was asked to design a ceramic mural for the lobby. His 16-foot-tall design still graces the lobby of the Hilton. He designed and built a circle house in Central Texas. Using 2-story brick walls to form the 18-sided cylindrical shape, the roof was sprayed with fiberglass and cement and covered with metal. The fiberglass design resembles a circular Japanese fan. The design won international acclaim in Spain in 1973 and in 1974 by architects gathered at the Udine Structural Shell Conference in Italy. Buck Winn's last commissioned art assignment was for the Commercial National Bank in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1970. The bank was building a new location, and they requested a mural for the lobby entrance that told the story of Arkansas. Buck created 40, each 16 inches square, that had symbols of Arkansas history, commerce, education, industry, station. Is no longer there. The artwork was taken down and is now in storage, awaiting a wall space that is large enough to display the Arkansas mural. His last signed art piece was not an assignment. It was a work of love for his church in Wimberley, Chapel of the Hills. This fiberglass and string window sold in 1972. Kitty Winn died in 1978, and Buck died in December 1979. During his lifetime, he created more than 50 major works of art in paintings, murals, ceramic, cement, and fiberglass. His satisfaction came from the creative process itself, not in accolades for the finished pieces. His contributions to the world of art have remained mostly hidden, as some buildings that were decorated were torn down and others abandoned. There are still Buck Winn discoveries hiding out there.
Art wasn't made to be put in a closet. If you don't see it, you don't remember it. And so it's our job is to when we say Buck Winn, we associate it with X mural composition, X X easel painting or whatever. We need to have a visual connection, and the only way we're going to do that by keeping him in the conversation. Being a squeaky wheel. We don't squeak the wheel, it'll never get any grease.
I just don't believe that the core qualities of American, what it means to be an American, are limited to those things that happen on the coasts or in the Brandywine Valley of the Delaware River. I think that there was created across America, in mid-America, in small America, even in Texas, that had an impact on our lives where we lived. And I think Buck Winn was one of those artists, and I think that's why the people who built a building in this region, Southwest region, including Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Arizona, and New Mexico, those people looked to a local artist to decorate their buildings and to commemorate their history and to often we need to tell our history stories. We need to restate them for each succeeding generation or for people who move into an area. And we need to tell those stories and tell them not because they have been stamped with given a stamp of approval from critics in New York or critics in Los Angeles or San Diego or wherever, but because they understand the art that's being created by regional artists. They understand, they appreciate it, and hopefully by continuing to expose it to them, they will continue to value it and talk about it to their children.